911 was an emergency. What's going on? Who had the knife? What's going on? Is someone hurt?
She's stabbing my mom.
She stabbed your mom? Please, 2518 Chagrin Drive, let us female with stab wounds. Attention.
At 1:17 in the morning, a phone call ripped through the silence of a quiet street outside Cleveland. A 13-year-old tried to explain the unexplainable. Her mother had been attacked, and the person holding the blade wasn't a stranger in the dark. It was someone already inside the house. The operator kept asking for calm, for details, for a reason that could make sense. But the truth is, there are nights when a family doesn't fall apart. It's taken apart, piece by piece, by secrets no one knew existed. On the surface, it looks like one brutal moment: a foster daughter, a knife, and a mother who never makes it out of her bedroom. And the trap begins with a picture-perfect home that didn't feel dangerous at all. From the curb, the house looked like the kind of place where nothing truly bad ever happens. A front yard big enough for a trampoline, a wooden playset, and the small mess of everyday life. Inside lived Lisa, a social worker who spent her days helping families in crisis, and Kevin, a truck driver who spent long nights on the road. Lisa had 3 girls round her: Megan, 13, from her previous marriage; Haley, the little one, only 3; and Sabrina, the foster daughter who had just turned 18 weeks earlier. On paper, it sounded like the kind of story you want to believe in: a family opening their home to a teenager who needed stability, rules, and a second chance. And for a while, it even looked like it worked. That night, the routine felt normal. Kevin was out working. Lisa did what she always did, got Haley ready for bed around 10, knowing the little girl had a habit of wandering back into the parents' room later. Megan went to her own room. Sabrina stayed up a little longer, working on a school project, music in her ears, not paying attention to who walked where. And then, sometime after midnight, the small choices started stacking. Sabrina couldn't sleep. She said she had a headache. She went downstairs toward the medicine cabinet in Lisa and Kevin's room. That's the last normal checkpoint anyone can agree on. After that, the story turns into a blur of noise, movement, and a single moment that Megan would never forget. Because around 1:15 a.m., Megan heard a struggle. She ran toward her mom's bedroom, and what she saw wasn't a nightmare from the outside world. It was a nightmare with a familiar face. And once that door opened, there was no going back. But what exactly did Megan see in that room? And what did the first officer find seconds later? When the patrol car swung into the driveway, the first thing the officer saw wasn't a masked intruder running away. It was Megan, still holding the phone she'd used to call for help, begging him to stop what was happening inside. The officer moved down the hallway toward the bedroom and called out for Sabrina to come out with her hands up. And she did. Sabrina stepped into view, covered in blood, sobbing, and still gripping the weapon. She had small cuts on her hands and legs, the kind that can happen when someone holds a blade too tightly in a chaotic moment. Inside the bedroom, Lisa was beyond saving. Later, investigators described the sheer number of injuries, 178, along with signs she tried to defend herself. The knife itself was large, serrated, and bent from the force used. A 3-year-old child had hidden in the closet, silent and terrified. At first glance, police had a clear suspect and a clear scene. Foster daughter, weapon in hand, blood everywhere. A teen's frantic call. It looked like an open and shut nightmare. The only thing missing was a motive that made sense. Why would someone who had been welcomed into a home do this? Why would a young woman turn that home into a crime scene? People tried to answer fast, because fast answers feel safer. They reached for the easy label: jealousy, rage, a bad kid who couldn't be fixed. But detectives kept circling one detail that didn't sit right. Kevin was out working, meaning the household was supposed to be all women and children that night. Yet as the hours passed, another story began to crawl out of the shadows, one where the violence wasn't random at all, one where the person who looked farthest from the weapon might have been closest to the decision. And that brings us to Sabrina herself, because to understand why she was in that house, you have to rewind years before the 911 call, back to a childhood that trained survival over stability. And once you see where she came from, the next twist feels even colder.
Sabrina Zunich didn't grow up with rules. She grew up with alarms, sirens, shouting, and the constant sense that stability was something other kids got to have. Her parents had long histories of arrests and chaos. Neighbors later described a home where police visits weren't rare. They were routine, like the mail. Even as a baby, the adults around her treated parenting like a problem to quiet, not a responsibility to protect. There are details from her early years that make your stomach drop, not because they're sensational, but because they're so careless. Stories of alcohol in the house, of a father who drank hard and behaved unpredictably, of violence that spilled into the walls and then spilled into her. When a child's first lessons are fear and survival, you don't teach them manners later and expect the damage to vanish. You teach them to obey the loudest voice in the room because that's how you stay safe. As Sabrina got older, the trouble followed. She was diagnosed with ADHD early on, and records described anger issues, fights at school, stealing, lying, and substance problems. By her teenage years, she was moved into a county-run group home built for strict behavior modification. That's not a place a kid goes because everything is fine. It's where the system sends you when the adults around you have failed and the consequences are stacking too high. But here's the twist. Once Sabrina was transferred schools and placed with a foster family, she seemed to flip. Attendance improved. Work got done. She kept her head down. People saw what they wanted to see. A troubled teen finally finding her footing. And that foster family was the one with the trampoline in the yard. Lisa opened her home the way she opened her heart, believing compassion could be a reset button. For a while, it even looked like she was right, but underneath that neat surface, the house was already splitting into teams, and the person who chose the teams wasn't Sabrina, it was Kevin. And what Kevin offered her wasn't just support, it was something far more dangerous.
Lisa wasn't new to hard stories. As a social worker, she spent her days inside other people's worst chapters. Kids bounced between homes, parents drowning in addiction, families tearing at the seams. That work can harden you, but it can also make you believe you can step in and be the calm in someone's storm. When Sabrina entered their home, Lisa treated her like part of the family, not a case. Kevin played the role too. To outsiders, he looked like the steady husband who worked long hours and came home to a bustling house. In 2009, Lisa and Kevin had their youngest, Haley. Megan was older, still adjusting to a blended family. Sabrina was the teenager in the mix, smart enough to spot every tiny difference in attention, every unspoken rule, every look that said, "You're not really ours." That's where friction starts in a lot of foster homes. Sabrina reportedly complained that Lisa showed favoritism toward her biological daughters. Arguments escalated. The household began to feel divided. Lisa and the girls on one side, Sabrina and Kevin on the other. And the more Sabrina clashed with Lisa, the more Kevin became the safe adult she ran to. Think about the psychology of that for a second. A teen already wired for survival, already desperate for belonging, gets into constant conflict with the foster mother. Then the foster father steps in as the comfort, the protector, the person who gets it. It's the perfect setup for manipulation because the teen doesn't realize they're being cornered. They think they're being chosen. Friends noticed things that felt off. Too much touching, too many inside jokes that sounded adult, a closeness that didn't look like a father-daughter bond. But people didn't want to believe what that might mean, so they didn't push it. They chalked it up to awkwardness. They looked away. And behind closed doors, Sabrina started saving Kevin in her phone under a name that should never exist in a foster home. She wasn't calling him Dad, she was calling him Love. And that's the moment the story stops being about a troubled teen and starts being about a predator with time, access, and a plan. But the plan didn't begin with violence. It began with secrecy.
What was his relationship to you?
It was when a foster father when needed to be and when a lover when not being a foster.
Sabrina later described Kevin's role with a sentence that lands like a punch. He was a foster father when he needed to be and a lover when he wasn't. That line tells you everything about the power imbalance. A teenager doesn't date her foster father in a normal, equal way. If it happens, it's because the adult holds the keys: money, shelter, authority, approval, and the ability to punish or reward with a single conversation. Kevin understood that. He also understood the house had rules, so the relationship had to stay hidden. Lisa couldn't know. Megan couldn't know. Even little Haley couldn't know because kids repeat what they hear. The secrecy became its own bond, like a private world inside a family home.
And the more secret it was, the more it felt to Sabrina like proof it was real. Meanwhile, the tension between Sabrina and Lisa didn't fade. It sharpened. Sabrina said Lisa wanted her out. She felt protective over Haley and resented being kept at a distance. There was at least one incident where Lisa restrained Sabrina physically and the police were contacted, but nothing changed. On paper, the home still looked stable. That mattered because Sabrina was about to age out of the foster system. She turned 18 in October 2012, an adult, technically free to leave. Instead, she petitioned to stay with the family, and it was approved. Her social worker saw no red flags. Sabrina was doing well in school, attending counseling, passing drug tests. It looked like the foster placement was a success. But that approval also meant something else. Sabrina was now legally an adult living under the same roof as a man who was supposed to be her guardian. And if the secret ever came out, it wouldn't just be scandal, it would be criminal. So ask yourself, what happens when an adult has everything to lose if the truth surfaces? What happens when the foster mother, the only person who can pull the plug on the arrangement, starts to suspect something? Because in the months leading up to the murder, the marriage between Kevin and Lisa began cracking in public, and one domestic call in September gave investigators a glimpse into how ugly those cracks were getting.
By September 2012, the calm mask was slipping. Police were called to the house after a fight. Lisa accused Kevin of choking Megan. Kevin claimed it wasn't choking, it was him grabbing the back of her neck to steer her into her room. Either way, that's not the language of a peaceful household. It's the language of a man trying to control the story before the story controls him. Kevin even spoke to police with an eye on the future, like he was documenting evidence for possible divorce proceedings. That alone is chilling because it shows he was already thinking ahead. And according to later testimony, he told Sabrina he wanted a divorce so he could be with her. But he also told her he was afraid of losing custody of the girls, especially little Haley, if Lisa left. Then came the confession to a friend. On a camping trip with an old buddy named David Strunk, Kevin admitted Lisa suspected he was having an affair with their foster daughter. He showed David photos of Sabrina, including modeling shots he'd helped her put together, even underwear she had bought him. That detail matters because it shows the relationship wasn't just a rumor. It was something Kevin was proud enough to hint at, like a secret trophy. Kevin said he was seeing a divorce attorney. He painted a picture where everything was in motion. Lisa was suspicious, the marriage was tense, and he was preparing to break free. If you heard only that, you might assume the story ends in separation, custody fights, bitter court paperwork. But then you remember the date, October 2012. 1 month before the murder. And the closer the calendar crept toward November, the more the stakes rose. Because if Lisa divorced Kevin, the affair could be exposed. The foster arrangement could collapse. The secret world could end overnight. So Kevin needed another option, one that didn't involve sharing custody or splitting assets. Something permanent. That's when a new word entered the conversation: life insurance. And once money becomes part of the story, the motives get sharper and the lies get colder. Because it's one thing to want someone out of your life. It's another to calculate what they're worth if they're gone. And that's where this takes a truly dark turn.
After the murder, people expected Kevin to look broken. Instead, multiple officers described him as strangely calm, almost clinical, asking for every detail, talking as if he'd seen stuff like this before. He was frustrated that police wouldn't let him see Sabrina, ranting that he was her foster father and needed access. That reaction raised eyebrows, because most husbands in shock don't make visitor lists. They collapse, they grieve, they ask why. Kevin asked, "Where is she?" Then, his behavior outside the station made the suspicion even louder. Within days, he donated Lisa's belongings to Goodwill. He tried selling her bedroom furniture on Craigslist. He asked a friend to shut down her social media because he couldn't handle the messages. And 5 days after her death, he hired a cleaning company to scrub the crime scene. His manner, according to people who interacted with him, was matter-of-fact. Money was no object, he said, because he had a $250,000 life insurance policy. But the $250,000 was only the appetizer. In the weeks that followed, Kevin collected roughly $785,000 across multiple policies from his employer and private insurers. That's not a minor payout, that's a life-changing number. And he didn't treat it like a rainy day cushion, he treated it like a green light. He paid off their previously foreclosed house. He added a swimming pool. He bought new cars. He even took flying lessons, chasing a fresh start, while Sabrina sat in jail awaiting trial. Here's the gut twist. If Kevin truly believed Sabrina acted alone, why was he moving so fast? Why erase Lisa's presence from the house like she was a bad memory you can donate and clean away? Some people will argue grief looks different on everyone. That's true, but this wasn't just different, it was efficient. And the longer Sabrina sat behind bars, the more she realized the promise she'd been sold wasn't real. The lawyers didn't appear, the protection didn't come, the future she'd imagined with Kevin didn't exist. And after 9 months, she decided she wasn't going down alone. That's when she started telling a story that turned the case upside down.
In the first hours after the attack, Sabrina tried to play confusion. She told investigators she didn't remember what happened. She claimed she entered Lisa's room for medication, and then everything went blank. She acted incoherent, uncooperative, as if the entire night had been swallowed by darkness in her mind. But later, another explanation surfaced, one that made those first statements look less like trauma and more like strategy. According to Sabrina, the No Memory Act wasn't her idea. It was part of a script she'd been given. Kevin allegedly told her that if she was caught, she should claim insanity. That way, she'd avoid a full sentence. He allegedly promised lawyers, support, and a future. The message was simple: do this, and you'll be taken care of. 9 months passed, and nothing happened. No legal dream team, no rescue plan, no secret visits that meant we're still together. Sabrina sat with the reality that she'd been used, and the love story she thought she was living was actually a setup. That's when she made the move that would change everything. She approached prosecutors and asked for a deal. She would cooperate. She would tell them what she knew. She would stop protecting Kevin. And what she described wasn't a spontaneous outburst. She described a relationship, manipulation, and a motive so ugly it sounded like something from a thriller. She said Kevin didn't just want a divorce, he wanted Lisa gone, permanently. Because as long as Lisa was alive, Kevin risked losing custody, losing money, losing control, and most importantly, losing the secret he'd built with Sabrina. Now, whenever a case rests heavily on one person's testimony, there's a question. Is it true, or is it a story designed to reduce blame? That's where this gets complicated. But prosecutors didn't take Sabrina's words alone. They started pulling threads, friends, messages, conversations. And one of those threads led to a teenage friend named Autumn and a conversation that sounded like murder for hire. And when that thread tightened, Kevin's perfect getaway started to crack. Sabrina said the planning didn't begin the night of the murder. It began with talking, with hypotheticals, with what-if conversations that slowly stopped sounding hypothetical. She and Kevin allegedly discussed getting someone else to do it, like outsourcing the unthinkable so they could keep their hands clean. One key name in that part of the story is Autumn Pathak, a friend of Sabrina's from school. According to Sabrina, the three of them, Kevin, Sabrina, and Autumn, talked in a car on the way to a Chinese buffet about having one of Autumn's contacts carry out the hit. Autumn eventually moved to California, and nothing came of that specific plan. But Sabrina said they didn't give up. They kept discussing methods, timing, and how to make it look like anything except what it was. Once prosecutors got involved, they contacted Autumn, and she agreed to help, meeting with Kevin while authorities recorded. In that conversation, Kevin didn't openly confess. The talk was slippery, careful, like someone avoiding the exact words that could bury him. Search warrants on his house, vehicles, and electronics didn't turn up the smoking gun investigators wanted. But the case didn't collapse because prosecutors had a different weapon, a cooperating witness who knew the relationship, knew the dynamic, and could tell a detailed story of how it unfolded. In August 2013, Kevin was arrested and charged with complicity to commit aggravated murder and sexual battery. That last charge mattered because it moved the story out of he said, she said territory and into something more concrete. It framed the relationship as criminal, not romantic. It said the adult wasn't the victim of a teen's obsession. He was the person who crossed the line. Still, Kevin pleaded not guilty. His defense argued there was no evidence of an affair or a plot, only Sabrina's word. And Sabrina, they said, was unstable and unreliable.
They tried to paint her as chaos personified, the kind of person you can't trust with anything, let alone a story this massive. It was a smart defense because it pushed jurors toward the simplest explanation: blame the teen. But the state was about to build a narrative of its own, one stitched together from behavior, timing, and motive. And when jurors saw that pattern, the case stopped feeling like random violence and started feeling like a relationship that turned lethal. And the most disturbing part of that pattern was how Kevin positioned himself as both guardian and partner, because that's where control begins.
In that house, when Sabrina felt singled out by Lisa and pushed to the side, Kevin became the one person who seemed to step in and make her feel safe. And once someone becomes your safe place, they also become the one person who can quietly steer your decisions. Some of Sabrina's friends later said the connection between them felt too close, like the boundaries weren't where they should have been. The jokes sounded older than they should have. The comfort looked heavier than normal. But most people don't want to believe what those signs might mean, so they ignore them. Inside the home, the relationships began to split into sides. Lisa became the rule setter, the one enforcing structure. Sabrina became the one reacting, pushing back, feeling cornered. And Kevin stayed in the middle as the quiet understander, the one who made Sabrina feel heard. The more conflict Sabrina had with Lisa, the easier it became for Kevin to position himself as the only person she could truly lean on. And once that dependence forms, shaping someone's reality gets easier because they start trusting your version of the world over everyone else's. That's why Sabrina's later statements mattered so much, even if you're skeptical. She wasn't describing one sudden moment, she was describing a slow build. She claimed Kevin kept feeding her the idea that the marriage was collapsing, that Lisa was destroying everything. And then came the moment Sabrina described as the turning point, the morning before everything happened. She said Kevin pulled the car over during the school drive and said something that hit like emotional blackmail, something designed to make her feel responsible for what came next. And after that, the story stops being about confusion and starts feeling like momentum. According to Sabrina, the final push happened in a car on an ordinary school morning. Kevin was driving her like he always did. Then he stopped and got upset. He described a fight with Lisa so bad he said he couldn't stand it anymore. And then came the line that turns your blood cold. He suggested he might end it if Lisa wasn't gone. Not as a cry for help, not as a confession of depression, as a weapon, a way to make Sabrina feel responsible for his survival. If you're a teenager who thinks this man is your entire future, that kind of statement can feel like a countdown. Sabrina later said she told him she would do it. She would make sure Lisa was gone. In that moment, love stops being love. It becomes a contract built on panic. Sabrina described planning details that sound disturbingly practical. They talked about doing it at night while Lisa slept and doing it in a way that wouldn't wake Haley because Haley sometimes climbed into the bed in the middle of the night. They discussed where to strike depending on how Lisa was lying, how to move in and out, how to make it quick. And if Sabrina was caught, she said Kevin coached her to claim she wasn't in her right mind. Listen to how calculated that is. This wasn't a teen grabbing a kitchen knife in a sudden rage. This was a series of decisions guided by someone who understood consequences, who understood money, who understood that a dead spouse can't divorce you or expose you. Now, Sabrina's account is still her account. You can debate whether she shaped the story to lessen her own blame, but the timeline that followed added weight to her version. Kevin's odd calmness, the speed he cleaned the house, the way he cashed in policies, and the way he didn't rush to protect her once she was arrested. So when the night of November 12th arrived, the question isn't just, what did Sabrina do? It's what did she believe she was doing it for? Because in her mind, this was supposed to be the start of their new life. And the moment Megan heard the struggle and ran to the bedroom, that fantasy shattered forever. But the bigger shock came later, when investigators asked if Kevin wanted Lisa gone, why was he willing to risk his own daughter being in the house? That's where the story reveals its ugliest layer. After the police took Sabrina into custody, Kevin arrived and demanded to know about his girls. He picked up Megan and Haley from the police department around 5 a.m. because Sabrina was being held. Officers who dealt with him that morning noticed his composure. He wanted information. He wanted control. He wanted to manage the situation. That matters because when people lose someone they love unexpectedly, their brains short-circuit. They stumble through conversations. They repeat the same question. Kevin didn't come across that way.
He came across like someone trying to keep the wheels from falling off a machine. Meanwhile, Sabrina sat in interrogation rooms and jail cells, still holding the story she'd been told to hold. No memory, no motive, no explanation. And for a while, it almost worked. The case looked simple. The teen did it. The foster system failed. End of story. But cases like this don't stay simple when money enters the picture. Detectives and prosecutors started hearing whispers about life insurance. They started hearing about an affair that sounded impossible until witnesses started mentioning the touchy behavior, the secret name in the contacts list, the modeling photos, the domestic dispute. The facts didn't line up with a random explosion of rage. They lined up with an escalating conflict, a secret relationship, and a man with something to lose. And once that suspicion took root, every action Kevin took after the murder looked less like grief and more like cleanup. The donations, the Craigslist listings, the cleaning company, the sudden comfort he bought himself with insurance money. That's why the next phase of the story feels like watching a mask peel off slowly. Prosecutors didn't have to prove Kevin held the weapon. They had to prove he helped make the decision. And to do that, they turned the spotlight on the one person.
Before Kevin ever stood in front of a jury, Sabrina's fate was sealed in a different way. She pleaded guilty to aggravated murder. The sentence was life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. That detail matters for two reasons. First, it means the state wasn't giving her a free pass. Second, it means her cooperation came with a price she couldn't undo. People hear plea deal and assume it means the witness is lying for an easy way out. But in this case, the out was a date decades away. What the deal really did was flip the storyline. It turned Sabrina from the main villain into the state's insider, someone who could explain the emotional mechanics behind the crime. In court, the state's argument was that Kevin didn't just have an inappropriate relationship with Sabrina, he used it. He allegedly wrapped her in promises, isolation, and a shared secret, then pointed her at Lisa like a weapon. Sabrina's history, her diagnoses, her instability, her past substance issues didn't make her innocent, but it did make her easier to control. That's what prosecutors leaned on. Vulnerability plus manipulation equals disaster. Kevin's defense pushed back hard. They argued there was no physical proof of the affair, no definitive evidence of a plot, only Sabrina's word. They painted her as unreliable, as someone who could change her story to save herself. And they tried to turn the jury's attention back to the most obvious fact. Sabrina was the one who walked out of that bedroom holding the weapon. This is the moment where the case becomes a human puzzle. Two truths can exist at once. Sabrina can be responsible for what she did, and Kevin can be responsible for what he set in motion. The courtroom wasn't just deciding who did the act, it was deciding who pulled the strings. And juries don't like gray areas. They want the clean answer. The state had to give them something they could hold on to, details that matched behavior, motive that matched money, and a relationship that matched the charges. As the trial unfolded, those pieces began to lock together. Because the more jurors heard about Kevin's conduct, the less he looked like a grieving husband, and the more he looked like a man trying to write a new life for himself. And the verdict would show exactly what they believed.
On June 11, 2014, after hearing weeks of testimony, the jury reached a decision that stunned anyone still clinging to the Sabrina acted alone narrative. They found Kevin guilty on every count, 11 in total. The charges weren't just about the murder. They included multiple counts of sexual battery, cementing the idea that his relationship with Sabrina wasn't a forbidden romance, it was abuse of power. The sentencing reflected that complexity. Kevin received a life in prison for complicity to aggravated murder, plus additional years tied to the sexual battery counts. In Ohio's system, the practical effect is that he isn't looking at a quick parole hearing. Official offender records list his parole eligibility decades into the future. The dream of a new life he chased with insurance money ended behind bars. But here's what makes the verdict even more unsettling. The state still didn't have a clean, cinematic smoking gun. No text message saying, "Do it tonight." No audio recording of Kevin ordering the murder. What they had was something messier, and in real life, often more convincing. behavior that made sense only if he was involved, witnesses who saw the inappropriate closeness, financial actions that looked like planning, and a cooperating witness who could describe the private conversations. In other words, the jury believed the pattern. They believed Kevin wasn't a bystander to Lisa's death. He was part of the machine that produced it. And then there's Sabrina, who went from foster child to defendant to star witness. She was sentenced, incarcerated, and left to carry the weight of what she did. Her parole eligibility date sits decades away too, a reminder that whatever Kevin promised her, the real outcome was steel doors and time. It would be comforting if that was the end. Bad people go to prison, case closed, lesson learned. But this story doesn't stay inside the courtroom. It leaves ripples through Megan and Haley, through the foster system that approved Sabrina's continued placement, through the question every viewer keeps asking, how did no one stop this sooner? Because the truth is, the murder night wasn't the first alarm, it was the last. There were earlier warnings, moments where a different choice might have changed everything. And when you look back, those warnings aren't hidden at all. They're sitting right there in plain sight, like a sign nobody wanted to read. And the clearest sign was the relationship itself, because it didn't start with violence, it started with a man building a private kingdom inside his own family.
For Megan and Haley, the verdict didn't bring their mom back. It didn't erase the night Megan ran toward a bedroom and saw something no child should ever see. It didn't undo the months of living in a house where trust was quietly being poisoned. All it did was confirm what the system rarely says out loud. The danger wasn't outside the family. It was inside it. After Lisa's death, the girls were uprooted. Reports say Lisa's relatives stepped in, taking custody and trying to rebuild a sense of safety from scratch. Imagine being Megan, 13, suddenly without your mother, with your stepfather accused of using a foster child as a weapon, and with your home turned into evidence. Imagine being Haley, 3, old enough to remember fear, too young to understand why the adults around her were gone. When people talk about true crime, they often focus on the suspects like they're characters in a show. But the real story lives in the survivors, the kids who grow up with fractured memories, court transcripts, and the lifelong question of whether the adults in their lives truly protected them. And here's the bitter irony. Lisa's job was protecting families. She spent her career trying to keep children safe. She welcomed a teenager into her home because she believed in giving people a chance. And in the end, the danger came through the exact doorway she opened. That's why people still argue about this case. Some focus on Sabrina as the primary villain because she held the weapon. Others focus on Kevin because he had the power and the motive. But a more honest takeaway is that both can be true. One person committed the act, and another person built the conditions that made it possible. Even years later, those questions don't disappear. If Sabrina had never been placed in that home, would Lisa be alive? If Kevin had been removed the moment the relationship crossed the line, would the murder have happened? If the domestic violence call in September had been treated as a serious warning, would the timeline have been interrupted? You can't rewrite the past, but you can map it. And mapping it is what investigators, journalists, and viewers keep trying to do, because it's the only way to make meaning out of a loss this senseless. And the map leads to a disturbing conclusion. The foster system didn't just miss a red flag, it approved a situation that allowed it to grow. And the way that approval happened is one of the most chilling parts of the story.
When the headlines fade, the legal system keeps moving in the background. Kevin pursued post-conviction options, including filings in federal court trying to challenge what happened at trial. That's common in high-stakes cases, but the results didn't rewrite the verdict. The state's version of events stayed standing. And the prison records tell the blunt, present-day reality. Sabrina is incarcerated in Ohio, serving life with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Her parole eligibility sits in the 2040s, meaning she will spend most of her adult life behind bars before the state even considers release. Kevin is also incarcerated in Ohio. His sentence includes life for complicity to aggravated murder, plus additional time for the sexual battery counts, pushing his parole eligibility even farther into the future. Those parole dates aren't promises. They're the first moment the state even agrees to listen. Parole boards weigh conduct, risk, and the impact on victims' families, and they can deny release again and again. That matters here because some headlines make it sound like life with parole means an automatic return. It doesn't.
It means decades of waiting, then one hearing that can still end with the door staying locked. For everyone watching, it keeps the ending still unresolved. Those dates matter because they show this wasn't a short punishment for a mistake. It was the system labeling the crime as catastrophic. It was the law saying this wasn't just a murder, it was a betrayal of a family. And yet, even with both people locked away, the story keeps living online. Every few years, a documentary episode or a podcast drags it back into the light. Viewers argue about who was the real villain. Some say Kevin was the architect. Some say Sabrina was the engine. Some say both are monsters. End of discussion. But if you strip away the argument and look at the structure, the case is more like a cautionary tale than a whodunit. It shows how vulnerability can be exploited. It shows how a secret can turn into a weapon. And it shows how money doesn't just tempt people, it can speed up decisions they were already considering. Lisa's life insurance wasn't the only motive, but it made the motive cleaner. It created a future Kevin could picture. New house, new life, no divorce, no court, no accusations. The payout didn't cause the murder, but it made the murder feel like a solution instead of a risk. So the only honest ending isn't "and justice was served." The honest ending is a question. How many hidden dynamics like this exist in quiet homes, unseen until something terrible happens? Because the scariest part isn't that this happened once. The scariest part is how ordinary the setup looked right up until the night it exploded. And to understand that, we have to return to Lisa, the person at the center of it all. Because her story is what gets lost when everyone argues about Kevin and Sabrina.
Lisa wasn't a plot device. She wasn't the obstacle in someone else's love story. She was a mother who got up for work, packed lunches, and tried to build a safe home. She took on a foster placement because she believed her family had room for one more child to be cared for, one more person to be guided toward a better future. And that belief is exactly what makes this tragedy hit harder. Lisa did the thing society asks people to do. Help. Open your door. Give someone a chance. Trust the systems that are supposed to screen and monitor placements. Trust that adults will respect boundaries. Trust that your own spouse will protect the home, not poison it. Somewhere along the way, Lisa reportedly began to suspect something was wrong. She wasn't naive. She saw tension, she saw conflict, she made calls, she tried to manage the household like any overworked parent would, one day at a time, assuming it would eventually settle. But if Kevin really was involved, then Lisa was never dealing with ordinary conflict. She was dealing with an enemy living beside her, smiling at the table, acting like a husband while building a private relationship behind your back. That kind of betrayal is hard to imagine, which is why most people don't imagine it until it's too late. And that's the final cruelty of this story. It turns compassion into a liability. It makes helping someone feel like a risk. It makes viewers wonder whether opening your home is worth it. That's not fair to the many foster parents who do it right, and it's not fair to the kids who are placed in safe homes and actually get saved. But it is a warning about one specific kind of threat, the adult who uses a caregiving role as cover, the person who can hide in normal while doing something abnormal and dangerous. So if you take anything away from this case, let it be this: boundaries aren't cold. Boundaries are love. They're what keeps a family safe, especially when vulnerability enters the home. When those boundaries blur, the consequences can be catastrophic. And for Megan and Haley, the consequences weren't just one night. They were a new life built on loss. The court system delivered sentences, but it couldn't deliver a reset. Which brings us back to that first call, 1:17 a.m., a child's voice, a question that never stops echoing. Not who did it because we know, not what happened because it's documented. The question that lingers is the one that points outward to every quiet street and every perfect-looking house. How close can danger be before we see it? And if we don't see it, what does that say about the stories we tell ourselves to feel safe?
The easiest way to watch this story is to pick a villain and lock the door. Call Sabrina a monster, call Kevin a mastermind, and tell yourself you'd never let something like that happen near you. It's comforting, it's clean, and it's not how real life works. Real life is the slow slide. A teenager with a history of instability finally finds a home and feels chosen. A foster father crosses a line and turns secrecy into intimacy. A foster mother senses something off, but is juggling work, children, and the everyday chaos that makes proof hard to catch. A system sees improved grades and checks a box, and a marriage under pressure becomes a powder keg. Then money enters the picture, and escape starts to sound like solution. In the end, the law treated both Sabrina and Kevin as responsible, one for committing the murder, the other for helping make it happen. Their lives are now defined by prison walls and parole dates decades away. But the deeper sentence belongs to the survivors. Megan carrying the memory of that bedroom door. Haley growing up with her mother's absence as a permanent shadow. And maybe the most unsettling part is how ordinary the beginning was. A family, a foster placement, a backyard trampoline, a promise of a fresh start. The kind of setup you'd expect in an inspirational story, not a tragedy. That's why this case refuses to fade. It's not just violent, it's a betrayal wrapped in normalcy, and that's what makes it scary. It forces you to consider how much we rely on appearances, how much we assume good people can't do terrible things, and how easily power can be used against the vulnerable when no one is watching closely enough. So the final thought isn't just about this one home in Ohio. It's a question for every system and every family. When someone vulnerable enters your space, do you protect them with real boundaries, or do you assume love is enough? Because love without boundaries can be twisted, and in the wrong hands, it can become the most dangerous thing in the room. If this story made you uncomfortable, that's the point. Discomfort is how you notice what you used to ignore, and sometimes noticing is the only thing that stands between a warning sign and a 1:17 a.m. phone call.